Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another chapter of Experiencer Interviews. And today we've got another amazing soul coming to us from the US. We have Lisa Nelson on board today. Lisa Nelson, author of Earth's Secret Visitors, Are They Here to Help Us?, was born and raised about 25 miles west of Chicago. In the mid 1970s, as an early teenager, she caught the attention of the new kid in town, Rob, the exceptionally intelligent middle son of 5 boys whose family moved into a house adjacent to Lisa's neighborhood. In sophomore year, they began to date, and he soon began to detail a secret life of involvement with the alien beings, or interdimensionals, who told her of their intents in curbing the Cold War of the 1970s and eventually the early 80s. The beings used remarkable means of operating invisibly in the Earth realm, and Lisa will detail some of their methods and technologies. According to the ETs, Rob was the very old warrior living discreetly on Earth, saying he had been regenerated time and again. Lisa's initial reaction was skepticism, fearing that Rob was mentally ill. As time went on, she saw and experienced events that no human could have caused, and reluctantly, she came to accept that Rob was not lying about his activities with the ETs. From age 15 to age 30, Lisa was apprised of the ETs' activities, whose focus was nuclear weapons and the imminent threat to not only humanity and neighboring planets, but the overlapping dimensions where higher level beings exist. After graduating from college, the pair married and moved to New York City, where Rob quit the ET activities at Lisa's urging. He soon became ill, apparently due to separating from medical care from the ETs that counteracted radiation exposure during their activities. Things became overwhelming during the later years of her involvement, which she will tell us about today. So, Lisa, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Mr. Gray, for having me on.
Before we get into you and your like future husband's meeting, are you aware if you ever got groomed or into this reality, or did you ever have like paranormal stuff happen to you, ET stuff?
I talk about in the book that I felt like I was predisposed to curiosity and interest in ETs. I had also had a situation of clairaudience as about an 8-year-old where a dark being had interfered with my peace of mind by posing as God. I was a very young, faithful kid who thought she was going to be a missionary when she grew up. And I had considered the story of Abraham and Isaac in the Bible, where God tests Abraham and asks him to kill his son, basically sacrifice him. And I used to worry that my dad would want that. And I think that fear was preyed upon by a dark being who said, hey, I want you to prove that you love me more than anything. And I want you to end your life. And it frightened me very much, but I, from then on, knew that there were kinds of beings that you cannot see. You might be able to hear them or see them or have some other sensory contact with them, but they would not be physical in nature. And this group of beings that I encountered through Rob was very much not tangible in the tactile sense. They used types of technology, which I'll be available to talk about after I answer your question. But I had read Robert von Daniken's book, Chariots of the Gods, when I was about 12, and I had a burning desire to know if it was true. And I was like an open radar to that sort of information, although there was almost nothing available at the time. When my contact with Rob began, we did not yet have E.T. the Extraterrestrial, no Close Encounters, no Star Wars, no Terminator, no X-Files, none of those things. The only thing we had at that point in time for reference was Star Trek and maybe Lost in Space. There may have been some movies, but they were pretty rudimentary. Of course, we'd have War of the World, which was much earlier than that, but there was very little reference to go on. So when I began to encounter these beings, it was very disturbing to me because the only thing you could compare it to, and the thought that you go to right away is, there's got to be some craziness going on. This could be mental illness. But I did notice that when he moved into town, I was just at an age where I was longing for love. And I was kind of pining, like, who's going to notice me and love me? And when Rob came along, soon after or before, I had a dream in which he appeared in a dirt pile. And you have the photo of all the girls playing in mud with his house in the background. I had a dream where he was standing on that dirt pile. There was a prairie being turned into housing, which we were very sad about, but he was standing as a very powerful being, and there were smaller beings dancing around him in a circle. And that really seemed an odd sort of dream to have, because I wasn't having premonitionistic dreams yet. They started to happen later. But when he moved to town, I had a crush on him for quite a long time. He came around 8th grade, so we were young kids. We were just barely beginning to develop things like hair and adult processes. And I thought he was the neatest thing I'd ever seen. And for a while, I had quite a crush on him. And I did date someone else for a little while in freshman year, but he noticed me in sophomore year. One thing I will say to you in response to something you mentioned before we started recording was that there was a point in time where the beings told me that they had been interested in me for reasons of a genetic composition and that we would be together. So I don't know. Back then, they hadn't decoded the genome yet. DNA was still a mystery. They were trying to unlock that. So to be told that they had knowledge of these things and knew very predictably certain types of beings were going to come along was one of the examples of mind-bending advanced state that they had, because they were talking about things that we could scarcely do. We were just trying to figure out, or we knew there was DNA at that time, and they were really working on it, but didn't have that much on it yet as it is today. And it was the same with holographic technology. Back then, holograms were very crude, and they were working on it very earnestly, and they're still pretty rudimentary compared to what I was seeing with holograms that came later. So
let's talk about your meeting with Rob. And so how did things progress with you when you two were together? Did he jump into the ET subject right away to get that out of the way? What happened?
To my dismay, it came along pretty soon after, during the special time of going, oh, you finally noticed me. We had gone to a homecoming dance together, which was in early October. And by the end of the month, one evening, he said, I got to talk to you. It's serious kind of thing. And we went for a walk. It was getting to be the chilly time of the year. Fall was progressing. It was frosty out. And he said, I was adopted. The Barclays aren't my real family, and my real parents were taken. And I didn't understand what that meant at first, but he went on to describe that he and his parents had been driving in an automobile when he was quite young. A large craft had come over them and shone a very bright light, and the car had stopped, and that his father and parents got out to go see what was accosting them, a brilliant light over them in the road, and suddenly they were gone, and that he was left. So he was describing that his parents had been taken and then had been contacted by the beings who wanted to have a meeting or talk to him. And I had never heard any such thing. I think now there are stories like that have come to the foreground, but I asked him, well, how did they contact you? And he said, they called me on the telephone. And I thought that was absurd. But as it turned out, in time going forward, they did use the phone quite often as a means of communication, and they would always use Robert's voice, even if he wasn't anywhere there was a phone. For example, he could have been walking down the street, almost approaching my house, but they could be on the phone talking to me in his voice, which was an example of the very first time I had a situation where I was confronted with, he can't be walking down the sidewalk and be on the phone. Because at that time, cell phones had not been made public yet. It was too soon, and it was very startling to me. And that's when I began to realize that things were starting to look like they were what he was saying that they were. But in the beginning, he was talking about an encounter of his own with the beings. He asked me to pray for him that night, and I went home. And I kneeled on my dresser and pulled the curtains open, and I'm looking at the sky trying to see a UFO and didn't see anything. And so I went to bed after a while. My sister's like, "What are you doing?" And it left me with a lot of questions. And the next day he was very sullen and sad. And I asked him, "What happened last night?" And he said, "Well, they said my parents are gone. They got killed when a ship was exploded, having to do with something that had occurred connected with their home planet." So he then introduced the idea that they were asking him to be involved. And I'm thinking, well, what do they want with a 15, 16-year-old boy? And he just said, they want me to work with them. And I was really puzzled about that. Like, why him of all people? We're just kids. We're just high school kids. And the idea was soon introduced that they were going to be taking him up to the ship. And when he was taken up, he would be gone for periods of time and he would be doing things. And that in his place would be projected what they were calling a hologram. And that the hologram would be identical to him, except the programming would be insufficient to do the best duplication of his personality, but it would look like him, and it could project to the viewer, such as myself, that you would be feeling skin, feeling a solid body, feeling the warmth, giving you sensory information. But when I met him, it was a very crude version of him. It was, and I say in the book, think Terminator, although Terminator was many years in the future. It had not happened yet. This was not an imitation. It was stiff, almost militaristic, not very friendly, grabbed my hand when the first time was that I was going to be interacting with a hologram, and nearly pulled me to school, and not in the friendliest way. And I was not liking this at all. There was some setup as far as trying to get me used to this. So this may go back to your question about grooming. There was information that was given to me as far as how we were going to tell the difference between him and a hologram. And it was set up that there was going to be the snap of a finger, and I cannot snap my fingers because I have a curly thumb, but I hear that snap, and all of a sudden I'm with a different being. And for a while, I wanted to believe that he was faking it, but when the thing kissed me in the hall at school, I was like, no, that is not right. Two people cannot kiss the same identically. So that was one pretty big clue that something very odd was going on. And over time, there became a number of iterations of the hologram programming, and they ended up with different names, just like computer software does. But it was, the first hologram was number 2. That one got me really upset at a point, and so they got rid of that one and made a different one that was better. And they call that one number 3. And it went eventually all the way through iterations all the way to number 10. There was a 9 and a new 9, and that's, I don't know why they gave that a point. 0.0 sort of title, but we ended up calling them all 10 after a couple of years. It didn't make sense to keep track of them anymore. There were just enough of them that there were reasons for getting rid of each one and getting a new upgrade for it. And it was usually problems interacting with me or problems of control. Now, the idea of the Guardians was brought into this story where the Guardians were beings that were described as being like, quotes, the fabric of the universe. And I was having trouble imagining what that would be, but I figured it was something that was very well dispersed or very unembodied, not the sort of little green men that we used to hear about, but that they were present as protectors to smaller planets, enforcing freedom and sovereignty to less developed planets, especially ones that couldn't be part of the neighborhood of planets. They were talking to me normally through the holograms, which would tend to be during walks to school. So quite a few of the talks would happen between getting picked up for school. Rob would pick me up and we would walk to the high school, which was 3/4 of a mile. And during this walk, we would get to the corner of my street. I lived in the house next to the corner. There would be a stone path that would extend for a stretch and then rejoin with another road that was a spacious neighborhood. And we would walk down this neighborhood another, say, half-mile, and then enter the grounds, a very spacious lawn that led up to the high school. And that's where a great number of these conversations went on, where no one could really hear us. The holograms had to be announced by finger snap. Then I was dealing with something that was completely unlike Rob, except for what he looked like. And I wasn't liking them. I wasn't sometimes not getting along with them. There was one that I liked quite a bit because it was more like I wanted a boyfriend to be, and that got Rob mad. So that one got replaced because there was a question of my discernment about the difference between Rob and the difference between a hologram. And I was liking the way one of the holograms was treating me. And he got mad because I was fine with the company of that one. So there were issues that came up. We had the Guardians who had a mission, according to them, of wanting to unbalance the Cold War. And what they were saying was that they were monitoring military bases. They were doing exploration and developing technology that was meant to be married, a technology/magic marriage, because that was one way that they needed to be the most advanced in order to be able to protect the smaller planets, or even the United States, by being militaristically superior, more advanced than anything else that was coming along, because otherwise they'd be futile in trying to protect. But the message was they were very concerned about the arms race, the nuclear proliferation, and that they were monitoring quite a few military bases that were nuclear installations, and that they were making appearances with UFOs to and sometimes causing national security emergencies, and they were very well of what they were doing. There was no way to confirm that at the time. You didn't see it in the newspapers, really. I was usually complaining that I didn't get to see proof and didn't understand how any of this could be going on if I couldn't see anything about it, other than the holograms, which I still, in the back of my mind, had suspicions that Rob might have been faking it out. Originally, I thought it might have been a terrible joke. He was a funny guy. He could be a clown at times, and he was well liked for his sense of humor. Things were sometimes pretty serious between us because he started talking about doing missions and the holograms, and on rare occasion, the guardians would speak to me, which was a very different sort of encounter. Because a hologram was a snap of the finger, I'd get a different personality, and I'd almost get a briefing that was very stiff and informative, and to tell me what I needed to know. And sometimes they would tell me things about other cultures, other planets, things the Guardians wanted to work on, things in the military that they were interested in, incursions that may have gone on. And they started to talk about Rob as having a double life where he had been a very, very old being from another planet called Aeros. Now, I've seen an article where, according to the Pleiadians, they had a planet named Erros, and Rob called it Aros, and I'm finding the pronunciation very similar. So I had wondered if there was a little something to that. But they had talked about him as being a very, very old being, over 5 million years old, and that he had been regenerated many times and had, in fact, had other lives on Earth in earlier centuries, but he had lost his planet due to disease. They had been disease-free for quite a while, and they got infected by another planet. And when his family was escaping the planet, they had been shot down for fear that they had the virus. So he lost his family, and there was something very sad to him that surrounded his erosion, he called it, family. He talked about a brother, he talked about his parents, he talked about his father being a military guy, and then his mother being very artistic.
Can I ask you a question? Sorry.
Sure.
Yeah, you talked about a lot. So now Rob's parents, okay, they're star people, but was he seeded? Was his soul seeded to the planet, and then he started reincarnating into human bodies through like having a normal mother, but he would remember his past life? How does the whole process work?
I believe that the family was pretty normal. I did have one channeling experience with a woman who said that the family was part biotechnology, and as each kid came along, that the last one was almost completely human, but the first one, the least human, and that it was set up so that Rob would have a backstory to be on Earth. Now, I remained close to my in-laws after Rob's passing. He was not long for the planet, and that I'll talk about that later on. But according to a close channel who was a wonderful healer and has also left the planet by passing away, said that the family was partly generated so that there would be a backdrop for him to be present on the planet without being noticed. He was a different sort of person. He was very blonde, quite tall, very broad-shouldered. And I sent you those photos so that you could get an idea of his appearance. I have also been told that some of what happened was related to past life issues. So I think when you think about the nature of reality, it is very possible that people could be being regenerated, could be being reincarnated, could be having follow through of karmic issues per se, or even missions that may not have been actually fulfilled. If you do enough healing or have a gifted healer in your life, you may be aware of some of your own trajectories in that sense.
Are you aware if this was his first incarnation on the planet?
It was said that he was not, and during later years, they did give me items to show me traces of other lives that he had lived here. They had at one point given me, and I don't have these items anymore because I later had a relationship with a very religious man, and he was very fearful of the items, I would say, or very worried that they were connected with some type of demonization that I might have experienced. And it is unfortunate that those items are no longer here. But one item I was given was it was well over 100 years old. It was a German journal that had poetry written in it in beautiful script, and they said that it had been his. And there was a point at which in time they had brought me a magazine page that was featuring a certain artist who had been a great American landscape painter. And they said that he had had something to do with those paintings. And so there were some items that came my way that were of unusual origin, and they were attempting to give me evidence and proof. And I continued to demand, like, I need to go on a ship kind of thing. You should take me there so I can believe you. And I had an experience around my junior year. So I'm about 16, 17 years old at this point. I was asleep in my bed and had heard a formation of helicopters approaching my home from quite a distance. It was a loud rumbling, and it was steadily approaching, and I'm waking up, becoming aware of this ruckus, because it was not unusual. Well, it was unusual to hear something like that, especially in the middle of the night. It was the wee hours of the morning. And strangely, when I thought they would have been passing, they stopped over my front yard and stayed in position. And it was really a racket. And there were very bright lights coming in through the curtains, and nobody in my family is waking up. And my question I was asking myself is, why doesn't mom and dad wake up? Why doesn't my sisters wake up? What's going on? And as if hypnotized, I very calmly got out of my bed and walked down the hall into the living room, and light was streaming through the decorative windows in the front door. And I went on the front lawn, and I was looking up at a massive underbelly of a craft. As soon as I had come onto the front porch, all the helicopters left and went north. And so I was left with a very soft hum. I'm looking up and I see little small lights. It was low enough to almost be ceiling height, but higher, just above the roof of my house. And I tried to grasp how big this thing was by trying to see the end of its boundaries. And its length was longer than the deep backyard of the house across the street from us. And that yard was nearly 3/4 of an acre and narrow, rectangular. And that craft spanned as far as I could see. It was very large. Suddenly, I'm on my hands and knees looking down at my house through a clear window. On the inside of the craft, it's kind of bowl-shaped, it's curved, and I'm noticing the tiles on top of the house and the chimney and the top of a tree that I love, and going, wow, this is what it's like up here when Dad goes up there. And I hadn't grasped that I was in a craft, and a being says, turn around, stand up. And I turned around, and as I did, the window went from being transparent to being metallic. I'm still sitting on it, and they asked me to stand up. But I'm noticing a very tall person who looks a bit odd, almost like he was trying to be a friendly dentist. He had a white jacket on, like dentists used to wear. Maybe they still do. And seemed to look like he had a wig on. It was very loopy, almost like clown wigs, where they're just big curls. brown, and he's smiling really big, but I can see the real mouth behind it, and the mouth is straight and unmoving. It didn't even open. And I noticed that when he spoke to me, the mouth did not move. The smile kept on smiling. And I'm looking at a really tall guy, and he says, "We're not going to hurt you. We just want to ask you something." So I'm standing up by now, and I feel a question being asked of my mind, but I cannot hear the question. And in that moment, I'm feeling all of the memories of my mind being sorted through. It felt as if my mind had become much like a Rolodex, the secretary tool of the 80s, where you had index cards that would go onto a reel, a spool, and it was sorting, going through. And I objected, like, "Hey, let me give you the answer." And they said, "No, we'll get it because you would convolute it." So I mentally struggled in objection a bit because I didn't want them rummaging through my mind, but at some point they said, "Okay, it's good now." So whatever they were looking for, they found. And then they said, "Come over here." Before, I meant to mention, I had noticed a control panel, and I got really interested in it. And I'm like, "Oh, I want to see how this works." And suddenly a silver partition came up. It was like silver cloud or electronic cloud, and they obscured it and said, "Don't look at that." And as I was writing the book, guidance, or the divine beings, the angels who work with me as a healer, and we all have guides, and in the healing arts we call them guides, but a lot of them call them our guardian angel or something like that. They told me that the reason they had to obscure it was because it was telepathically controlled, and when I was looking at it, I could have tampered with the controls. So they made it so that I couldn't see it. And they had me come a little to the left. Tall guy was standing there, and I saw some really short beings. They had large round heads, but pointy chins, and very big almond-shaped eyes, and what looked like almost like a monk robe, almost brown and burlappy, with sort of a rope tie around the waist and very skinny, spindly arms. And they were huddling behind the leg of the tall guy. They didn't come much above. They came about mid, maybe towards the hip of him. But there were a number of them, and they were kind of huddled together and trying not to be seen. And I realized that they were trying to be invisible, but I could still see them. And they didn't want to get close to me, but I was noticing this. And then there was a tabletop that materialized. It just, no legs on it. It was suspended in air, and it was about this thick, about close to 3 feet, maybe 32, 34 inches wide. And it looked just like a regular tabletop, and I'm not even startled that it's floating. So you must think that when you've been on a craft and you're so calm about it, you're like, "Why wasn't I getting upset or freaking out?" They must do something to keep you calm. But he said, "Come over here." And as I approached the tabletop, these glyphs rose up and kind of came up out of the surface, kind of like the lids for car headlights go. They lifted up out of the table, and there were 3 rows. There were probably 30 of them. And the tall guy said, "Tell me which one is yours." So I looked at each glyph, and there was a resonation and even some communication with me. I had some sort of way of knowing what each one meant, but I didn't, in many cases, feel like it had anything to do with me. But then there was one that I said, I said, this one's me. So tall guy seemed pleased. And then there was a streaming from it. These glyphs had been either very intense ruby red or electric blue, like a really, really bright cobalt. And the stream started going into my eye, and I was seeing a vast number of images. Some of them I recognized even from dreams I had had that I had forgotten that I had. Things when I was a baby. I don't know why my own images were in there. I don't know if I had been given ideas, but there were things that were equations. And I even seemed to know in that moment what they were. And I said to myself, I really hope I can remember all this. I don't. Maybe it's in there somewhere. I'd love to find out. But this went on, it seemed for many seconds. It was really quite a profound stream of information. And I just took it in and just, whoa, I want to remember this. And then the next thing I remember, I was back in my bed. I had been placed back, and I had said the reverse of what I had thought to myself in the very beginning. When the helicopters had come over the house, I said, I'm asleep, but awake. And as I had been set back in the bed, my mind said to myself, I'm awake, but asleep. And then I was back in my normal position in life. And strangely, I don't even recall telling Rob that that had happened. We never talked about it. I just kept it to myself and kind of went, wow, or maybe it was placed into a part of my mind that just didn't say. You hear about people who have had encounters and they say, oh, no big deal here. And you don't have any freaked out response to it. You're just like, okay, that happened.
Do you recall how your symbol looked like?
I do. I sent a picture of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I showed it to Christopher O'Brien, whose books you may be familiar with. He commented that it reminded him of the symbol, the Mayan symbol for corn. And he talked about the spiritual meaning of corn and the relationship of the beings to their culture. And that was as much as we could come up with from that. Later on, I have located information from another website where a lady had contact with symbols. And she had been shown symbols that created an awareness, an expansion for her. And I would say that being in an experience of having had so much information streamed into my eye was quite amazing. And I do know that if the mind can contain all that, it is really a vast organ. There is a spiritual nature to it. Quite a bit of the technology actually follows spiritual means. For example, with the hologram, they were talking about 3 ways of being present on Earth. One was we take Rob up, we beam a hologram down. So that was referred to as the holograms. Another one was one time the guardians themselves came to talk to me, and that was a big deal because the guardians almost never made an appearance with me. But they said that what they did was they took his consciousness and put it in a conscious box, they called it, and took control of his body so that they could speak with me. And then there were visitors that I encountered around junior and senior year and first year of college, where beings were allowed to come and visit me, and they would come in Rob's form. And what that meant was they were made to look like Rob, but they were still themselves. There were situations where they could have been projected into his body and he was elsewhere, or projected as a person with his body. So should I talk about the visits?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. There were 4 visits that were challenging to me. The first one, the hologram called me one night after dinner and said, and we're going to pick you up and you're going to meet a very important military figure, and you get ready. We'll be there in a little bit. And the hologram came and got me and walked me to my next door neighbor's house. We used to take care of their cats when they would snowbird in Florida. So I was there every night after dinner, so it wasn't anything unusual. And I was walked over. As I was being walked from my driveway to go next door, helicopters again came and stopped over the street where we were walking. I do know a neighbor heard it because she went up to the window and cupped her eyes and was like looking, shielding her eyes from the inside light to see what was outside. So I do know that somebody saw these helicopters come very low. When we came outside, most of the formation left and one helicopter remained behind, and the hologram told me that this general had been working with the Guardians and they were giving him a reward, and the reward was to come and interview me. They were telling me that in other places they knew of Rob, whose ancient name was Tomar Ra, and that he was known as a warrior, and people would get news about it. And so they knew about me being the girlfriend of Tomar Ra. So to me, that seemed very far-fetched, because you're so not famous when you're trying to hide from everybody and keep a secret that you've been up to a UFO, or your boyfriend is doing all this weird stuff and you don't want to be thought crazy. So to me, that was just like, what? I have homework, I babysit, I have violin lessons, piano lessons, I get good grades, I have orchestra rehearsals, I have friends in the neighborhood, I have a boyfriend. This is not famous stuff. But the general came in the form of Rob, and the holograms prepped me by saying, you're the hostess. And this is like an act of, I don't know if detente is the word, but whatever the general wants, the general gets. And I was like, didn't know what that meant at all. He was very unfamiliar with the typical furnishings of a house. We went in a back bedroom so that the lights wouldn't be noticeable to my parents from next door. And he was doing things like fidgeting with doorknobs and trying to figure out how they worked, and looking under lampshades and laughing at the light bulb, because I had been told that the way light is on crafts and other places is that the light is omnidirectional. It doesn't come from any particular source. It just fills the room. It's even, there's no shadows. You don't need a light bulb, kind of thing. And he was just kind of poking around and asking me quite a few questions about Rob, Tomar, and life here, and what do I do. But then he changed the subject to wanting to get into my clothes, and he started to try to work my buttons, and he was having a real hard time with that. So I was like going, no, thank you. And the hologram snapped in and came back and said, nope, you can't tell him no. It would be bad will to turn him down. In other cultures, sexuality is not exclusive to just a partner. It is something that is shared freely, and think of it as being a good hostess. And I was like, I've hardly ever done this before. Anyway, I was feeling coerced and I was very uncomfortable. And he was trying to get into my clothes, and I was letting him have a hard time with it because he couldn't figure out how things worked, like a zipper or bra hooks and things like that. But eventually he got it figured out. And he said that he wanted to try being in a body. And that's what he was doing, was trying being in a body. So whatever form he was in may have been disincarnate or been some other form of life, but he was really enthralled with having a male response. He was looking at the member like he had never seen one before. He was like, it was comical in some ways, but it was upsetting to me in other ways. And I was very unhappy about the experience. And that led to the end of that hologram for being part of setting me up for that, because Rob found out about it. Something that happened as retaliation by Rob Tomar soon after. Or was that Alona? That might have been Alona. Well, that hologram was replaced. There were other visits. One was with a former girlfriend from the ship. The ship was described as a place that contained about 45,000 inhabitants, or whatever. They were comparing it to the size of the town I lived in at the time, which was about 45,000 population. They would describe entertainment to me as being not so much in an amphitheater, but there were musical concerts. Music at the time, they said, was being influenced through telepathic download and actual interaction with some of our major recording artists. They said that they were bringing them up to the ship and giving them songs and putting them back. So you can easily guess who those people may have been, because the stuff they were writing at the time was very otherworldly. Music was full of references to other worlds. So there was a female musician who had been a past relationship of Tomar's, and apparently she didn't take kindly to me, and she managed to get a visit with me one summer, and I wasn't really prepared for that, because I always felt like she wouldn't be nice to me. And when she did get down in Rob's form, she decided to have her way with me, and it was a very strange experience, having a situation of, you might even compare it to a date rape, where it's people start out real friendly, but then stuff happens that the other person isn't consenting to. But she decided that she was going to try being a male in a male body and experiencing the penis and, doing what she wanted to find out. And I didn't feel too good about that. And that led to retaliation by Rob for me being essentially invaded. And soon after, a hologram came and got me at the front door and said, wait, we need to go for a walk. We got to talk to you. And they walked me over to the elementary school where I had gone from kindergarten to 6th grade. And they said, we've got a real problem on our hands. Rob has brought a ship very close down to the neighborhood. And we have an emergency, because if we can't contain this information, he may have to relocate. So you better hope we can contain this. That's it for now. We've got some cleaning up to do. We have this situation. He's in a show of power now, showing us that he can do this. So we walk back to the neighborhood. The hologram goes onwards towards Rob's house. There is a group of neighbors who are standing on 59th Street looking to the sky, and there is something that is depicted on the cover of the book. I recreated that so that people can understand what it looks like to see something as behemoth as one of the World Trade Center towers floating high in the sky, unmoving, looking like it is tonnage, like the Himalayan mountain, just gargantuan, perfectly rectangular, incredibly bright light coming out of it, as if it was lightning light that was coming out in emanation, not in forked form as a lightning bolt would. And then around it was a nest of deeply dark plum clouds. Now, this was the summertime, so the sun at that time wasn't going up down till around 9:15 at that time of the year. So it sat in the sky there for quite a while, and a group of neighbors stood around saying, what should we do? Should we call the news? And I didn't want them to call the news because I didn't want there to be attraction to the idea that there was a UFO in my town. We were joking about it a little bit, but mostly we're mesmerized with this massive thing that was in the sky, unmoving, and there wasn't a single other cloud at the time other than the clouds that were nesting around the rectangle. So I used to call it the rectangle UFO. Years later, my book references a website that does talk about rectangle UFOs. So it turns out that there are over 3,500 documented sightings of rectangle UFOs. People don't really talk about them that much. They talk more likely to talk about a triangle UFO. The reason there's a triangle UFO on the book cover is because my brother-in-law, the youngest of the 5 brothers, was standing outside his home, and something glided very nearby him, very silently, and it was a very massive structure, which he calls a triangle UFO. And he said it looked like it was about 3 stories tall. So I put that in there for Mike. We remain close. He's just about the last brother. But here we were with a giant sighting in the sky, and we didn't know what to do about it. But eventually we all just kind of dragged out and went home, kind of just, oh, we don't know what that is. And years later, as I was researching the book and looking for someone who could give me their own account of seeing it, because there were 2 groups of people in the neighborhood who had seen it. There were at least 10 people. I found 5 people who could remember it and 5 people who could not remember it. They know they were there. They know we were looking at something in the sky for a long time. And if I say, what does it look like? They go, I don't remember. So that's why I had a graphic artist recreate the rectangle UFO, so that my neighbors could see it. But that was a sighting that was just really unusual, but it correlated the guardians and the holograms with something in the sky. There were a number of times where the holograms would take me for walks in the night and show me things in the sky that were not aircraft. They taught me how to tell the difference between a jetliner and one of theirs. They would point occasionally at a craft and say, that one's one of ours. You can tell because the sound is coming out the front of it, not trailing it. And there's a formation of lights under it where the box shape underneath looks different. So they were showing me how much air traffic they were able to have in the Chicago area without being detected. And they said that what they were doing was giving the information to air traffic control that told it to read it as a commercial flight. They could put an illusion on the craft that made it look like a commercial liner, but it was dark out at night too, by the way. So all you could read were the little lights that they could very easily create formations of to give you that look of a passenger jet. And they would also sometimes stop me and say, watch over there for a while, and there might be 3 unusual lights in a row that were never there. My neighbors and I had always been sky watchers since we were pretty young, because we loved to watch the Perseid meteor showers every year in August. We'd always be watching for lights flashing through the sky for the meteors. And there were 3 lights sitting in a row, and I watched them for over 20 minutes, maybe even 30 minutes, maybe even 40 minutes, because it happened more than once. And the hologram would continue to talk to me and then say, all right, look, they're going to disband now. And I'd look up in the sky, and the 3 lights, who were just sitting, not moving, even though satellites and air traffic and the stars were moving with the rotation of the Earth or their flight paths, they would take off in disparate directions, meaning one would go this way, one would go that way, one would go that way. in a flash, and they could tell me when it was going to happen. So I knew that they knew what was going on in the skies. And that's when I began to take for granted that I was in a story or in contact in a way where there were beings operating in a way that you really couldn't detect unless they told you. They talked about the use of illusion quite a bit. They could put, say, equipment in a basement of a church, for example, and make it look like a water heater or a furnace to someone. And it'd be a place where people didn't go very often, but they would talk about the fact that they needed to monitor the area because they had a person who was doing missions. Very often, Rob was writing things on paper that looked very cryptic, very angular, almost some type of other geometrical designs. And they would say that he was working on engineering designs or working on computers. He had a very high IQ. His father confirmed it to me, but it was higher than Einstein's. And that what they were doing in terms of attempting to curb the Cold War was to use the use of telepathic downloads to give engineering advances to aeronautics engineers. I did locate, or I did meet a man who was an engineer and a test pilot for the some of the government projects, and he was very well aware of one of the projects. The Guardians were very interested in the X-29. The first engineer I met showed me that he knew quite a bit about that project because he had the design aspects of the designs in his house. And he showed them to me, but he would not talk to me on record. He got very upset with me if I ever asked about it, but one thing he did say was he had seen quite a bit of UFO activity as a test pilot. And when he got mad at me one time, he said, all the UFOs are here for is to tell us what to do. And then he would shut down the conversation. And I didn't think I would ever get an interview from anyone who was privy to the engineering process of certain craft. But I did get help from the guides who had been urging me to write the book. At last, I had drafted it in 1994, but they asked me to return to it and come out and write it. And I was really afraid to. And I had so much healing to do because of trauma, the invasive situations, and frankly, the regeneration experience was really shocking. I mean, shocking in a harmful way to me. But I did eventually meet someone who was an engineer. I think it was arranged. Well, I know it was arranged because I was guided to go on a dating site, and within a day I was talking to an engineer from Skunkworks. And some of those innovations were coming from the Skunkworks being Northrop Grumman, Lockheed Martin, and the government. And they were working on back engineering things that they had. But the interview, most of what he told me, I wasn't allowed to put in the book. But what he did go as far as saying was that some of the iterations of the engineering of this craft, particularly the X-29, which had forward swept wings. So if this is the body of the jet, the wings went forward. They were forward swept wings. Rob was always grumbling about it. Damn, engineers keep getting the wings wrong. And they would always be monitoring that as far as the Guardians were telling. And according to this engineer, some of the iterations of some of the craft that were coming out were so beyond what had been previously designed. And they were just building them and not even actually drawing them out as in the small increments that were normally used. It was just going leapfrogging forward. And he went as far as saying that he did believe that there were telepathic downloads involved in some of the iterations of some of the craft. So the intention of the Guardians was to advance the United States ahead of the USSR because we were neck and neck, and there were so many nuclear weapons pointed at each other that we were, as kids, we were being taught what to do if a nuclear bomb went off. And I laugh now because they were basically telling us to get under our desk and put our arms over our heads as if that would help. It really wouldn't help, but there was this mentality of we have to be ready at every moment. As the United States advanced and got ahead, things changed. It did, things toned down. The USSR could not keep up with us. So I was grateful to have been put in the path of people who were involved in that process because they did see amazing things, did have a lot of privy to the vast amount of UFO traffic that there is in the skies and how much is being held back by the government. And one of them said, we take it for granted, but we're just not allowed to talk about it. So that's where things are with disclosure, I think. Given, my thought is, given the amount of advancements that they seek after, it's very concerning to me that the military wants to shoot anything that flies through the skies that isn't ours. It's troubling to me because we have been helped, at least by some beings. And you can talk about different groups of beings having their own agendas, but I do know that we did get ahead in the Cold War. I was told that they had this goal, and another introduction that was given to me very beneficially was to come into contact with Robert Hastings when I was in college. I was an electronic composition major, and he was just getting ready to go on the college circuit, doing lectures, because he himself had been on a janitor at Malmstrom Air Force Base and was in a control room at the time of UFO incursions over nuclear installations. So he always knew, given that that information had been suppressed, that the government was very actively keeping us in the dark. And he didn't think that was right. And he felt that there was a message being given in these appearances because they weren't destroying everything. And it's very clear to me that if they were nefarious, they would have done more harm than we could have even imagined. But they show up, make an appearance, and get out of our way because we have a very violent nature. But the government's approach to any kind of appearance is to chase it and shoot it. And that's why the title of the book is, Are They Here to Help Us? Because last summer when the disclosure hearings were going on, the question was never asked, could they possibly be doing anything beneficial? They only say, is this a matter of a national security issue? And the answer is always, well, of course it is. But I don't see that much harm happening. I do know that pilots who come too close to UFOs may be harmed by exposure to the energies, the emanations from these craft.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
Now, well, talking about their involvement during the Cold War, were there a lot of military personnel coming out telling that a lot of UFOs appeared over certain nuclear sites and where they disarmed the missiles or even activated them just to show them that they got control over them? You're probably aware of that.
I am aware that there were quite a few people who were silenced, quite a few people whose military careers were somewhat derailed, or they were sent to distant places. And quite a few of them were pretty well threatened to say, if you talk, your career is mud. Robert Hastings had a press conference, I think it was 2010, at the press club. And it was 8 or 10 military retired personnel who came out and gave accounts of their experiences being on site at the time of UFO incursions. And that was a very newsworthy, CNN had covered it. That was big news at the time. Robert Hastings' book was released in 2008, and it has 160 interviews with military personnel who were willing to come on record, though, and that's only people who were willing to go on record, only. But that book is a very voluminous book. I think it's well over 400 pages. I just glanced over to gander it. It's thick. And the interviews are very thorough and very precise because of the way military people describe the surroundings or a setting where there's an incursion. And it was wonderful confirmation for me that what the Guardians were telling me was in fact something they were doing. We are going to these places, we are monitoring, and we are keeping an eye on things. And we know that it creates national security emergencies, but we're working to suppress the threat of imminent nuclear war. We are very concerned about this. I happened to meet Robert Hastings while I was in music school. I was introduced by my professor after Robert had walked into the building, having no idea who to talk to. And he knocked on a door, and it happened to be my professor. And he said, get in touch with Lisa, she'll help you with some sound effects. And because of that, I knew Robert from long before I was even thinking about writing a book. I was completely in the closet, and we had been working together on some sound effects. And he would say things like, can you make it a little faster? Can you make it a little slower? And I would make these sounds for him, and I was giving him the reel. And he was saying, thanks so much. What can I do for you? And I said, well, you're a photographer. You could take photographs of my boyfriend. So the photo of Rob is on the cover of the book, and there are other photos that Robert took, which I've supplied to you. And it's interesting to see what he looks like, because he does look like an unusual person with his platinum blonde hair and the broad shoulders and the way he is very fit. But at the time I handed Robert the reel, and I said, you know, that's not how they sound. And he went, what? And I went, no, I shut up. And I went my separate way for quite a few years until 2017. I contacted him to see if he remembered meeting me. And he said, oh, yes, I remember you. You helped me with my multi-screen slideshow when I was going on the lecture circuit. Because at the time, the video had not appeared yet. This was pre-video. To have a multi-screen slideshow was considered high tech at the time. And his mission, he felt, was to try to get disclosure to happen. And he's been making quite a few sacrifices in his life to get the message out. A, the government is not being honest with us. And B, I think the UFOs who are coming here are trying to tell us to put those toys down. And one of the recurring things, as you mentioned, is they power them down. They bring them back up later. They're not destroying them. They're just toning it down. Like, don't run with scissors kind of message. And I was asked, as I was finishing the book, through guidance, to please write about the concerns of the guardians, of the beings, the advanced beings, which is the nuclear proliferation. Because at the time I was writing that, which is a couple of years ago, there were over 13,500 nuclear warheads. We could blow this planet to dust. We don't need all that. We need to be more evolved. Anyway, to go back to the story, after college, Rob and I got married and we moved to New York. I was thinking I would try my hand at being in the music business or being a recording artist because I had learned how to do audio engineering. We got married and came to New York City, and I ended up in the music business. Rob had begun to become ill. He had given up anything to do with the Guardians. I had asked him to please, let's have a normal life. And he agreed to that. And it wasn't long after we were married that he started acting strangely. I went to work one day and came home and he was still asleep in bed, and that not only concerned me, but kind of got me mad because I was at work all day and he was sleeping in bed all day. And I was like, what are you doing? And he was starting to not look well. And he wasn't holding a job very well. And there was beginning to be stress between us, and he was getting to have some behavior changes. And there was stress between us about that, me being the breadwinner and working very hard and him not holding a job very well. And eventually he got involved with a vigilante group. He said that they were police officers who were concerned about crack. At the time in New York City, vigilantism was very common. There were a lot of people who were very frustrated with the police force in New York City at the time. It was a major issue. And crack was a very big problem. A lot of people were dying over crack, and the police were involved on both sides, fighting it and taking part in it, even robbing dealers and taking their goods and then selling it, or taking money to cover for dealers so that they could operate in the way that they wanted. But Rob was very concerned about that, and being the do-gooder that we could say that he was. I was very upset about him getting involved in that because I thought it was obviously very dangerous. And I was beginning to think that maybe it wasn't the right thing that we had gotten married. Or earlier, the secrets that we held about the Guardians and the holograms and missions and the arms race and nuclear war and those things that I had been let in on held us together because no one else knew, and there was no one else but us. But now we were leading a much more normal life, and I was in the music business now, working with very famous people, and there was a lot of work to do there, and I was accelerating in my career, and he seemed to be deteriorating, but I didn't understand what it was about. It was almost like a failure to launch sort of thing in terms of the life progress of his earth life. And I was beginning to feel that with his personality changes, there was becoming some violence. And I began to demand that he get a job or we weren't going to make it. And he said, well, I'm in Democracy Now!, which was the name of the vigilante group that he was referring to. And they were starting to intimidate me on the street. And so I knew he was involved with people. And there were times when he knew things that I said on the telephone when he was not home, and he came home with the tape, and I knew that my phone had been taped. When I was confiding in a friend over the telephone, he came home quoting that tape. And I do not know how a guy such as himself could have managed to tap a phone without the help of other people who had means. But I was being intimidated. He demonstrated to me that he was communicating with somebody watching us from across the courtyard. They were doing hand signals to each other, and he said, they got to keep an eye on you. You're saying you're going to leave me and you know too much. And it began to become a threatening situation. I was getting really scared. I was hurt and angry. And around that time, I had also discovered healing through a chance encounter because I was feeling a need for some spiritual sustenance at that time. And I was beginning to pray for some help. and help did come. I had chance meetings where people showed me things that I really needed to be clued into to become who I am today as a healer. But what was happening was Rob was getting very angry about it because I was going to classes about healing and about, say, Egyptian mysteries or some of the esoteric arts. And he was not liking that. And I was not liking that he was in a vigilante organization and threatening me and keeping tabs on me in ways that seemed very untoward. And I was threatening to leave. And he said, if you leave, you're going to be in really big trouble. And I was feeling very frightened. And eventually, the violence was getting bad enough that there was a point where I was just about killed. And I got out of the apartment and said, I'm never going back. He convinced me that I was going to have to go back to keep myself from getting in super big trouble with the organization. And eventually what ended up working out was the violence got so bad that I escaped and just said, never going back. I don't want him to die. He had been, according to him, diagnosed with a neurological breakdown. And he was telling me that he was dying, and I was staying with him longer than I would have because I knew that if I left him, he would probably die or he would be homeless. And that's why I tolerated it for a long time. And then there was the issue with the threats and of being in trouble with cops who would go to great lengths to cover up their activities. So I was feeling like I was really in a terrible jam. But to make a long story short, he was having seizures. One night he nearly killed me. And this had been like a few times now. And I was weary and fried. And I got out and said, that's it. I'm never going back. And the next day at my job, he called me desperately saying, Lisa, please come back, come back. They're after me. They're after you. They need to know where you are. Just so they know where you are, you'll be okay. But if they don't know where you are, they're going to come and get you. So I was basically having my life threatened. At that point, I didn't care because if I went home, I felt like my life was at risk, and I felt like walking around on the streets, I was taking a risk as well. But he called desperately for a day, and the receptionist, who was my ally in these sort of troubles and blocking phone calls, she was fielding the calls and not letting him get through. Things went silent for a day, and then the next day, I got a phone call in his voice saying, this is the Guardians. Rob was killed, and you're going to be next if you don't listen to us. And I thought he was trying to play to fool me. So I started cursing at him and calling him a lot of things and saying, I don't believe you. And the Guardians in Rob's voice said, look at your phone. What line are we calling you on? And it turned out that the line that they were using, and this is before VoIP, and this is before computerized and digital voice, it was a tie line that went only between my boss's desk and my desk. It did not go to any outside lines whatsoever. Somehow they had gotten into the phone system and were using a line that only went from one desk to one desk. And when I saw that, and my boss was walking around in the office and they were talking to me through his line, I was startled, really shook, because I knew that something extremely high tech was happening for them to be talking. And they said, listen to us, stop yelling. The whole office was looking at me at this moment. Rob's been killed. His cohorts are looking for you. I had been blessed to have use of an empty condo through a colleague who knew someone who had a condo on the market, and they said I could stay there. So I was staying in a luxury high-rise. And nobody knew where I was staying except my colleague and the person who owned the condo. And I was in a high-rise about 37 floors up with security in the front, like doormen. So I felt safe that way. But the guardians told me they knew exactly where I was. They knew exactly everywhere I had been because I had walked away from everything I owned, including my clothing. He had sliced it all up because he was getting ready to show me he was gonna possibly cut me up as well. So I left with no clothing. Every day I had to go to the store and get a new dress to go to work the next day. I had to buy a toothbrush. I had to buy a hairbrush. I was starting over from nothing. And when they told me absolutely everywhere I had been, including that I had had a date that did not go real well, I was dumbfounded. And it happened that my friend Christopher O'Brien, who I had worked with in my first job in New York, called me up on an impulse. And I believe that he was prompted by the guardians or some beneficial being, because this is the moment I got off the phone with the guardians who said, we need you to do something up for us. We will help you get out of this mess, but we need you to do something for us. And we'll tell you what that is, but you got to let us know you're on board. The phone call ends, and then Christopher O'Brien, whose books you may be familiar with, calls and he's like, Lise, man, we haven't talked in a long time. I suddenly got this unbelievable compulsion to call you. And I was floored at that as well. So are we talking about grooming still? I was floored that he called me that same minute as the end of that phone call, because I was afraid, I was shocked. I didn't know if I could believe the voice was Rob or the guardians. I was shocked that it was coming through my boss's tie line, which had nothing to do with any possible access from the outside world or any other lines in the office. And Chris shows up offering help. So a wonderful friend he has been. And I told him some of what was happening, but I really couldn't tell him everything because I never had. When we had worked together in my first job in New York, he seemed very friendly. We would often eat lunch together, but he would also sometimes notice bruises on my arms, and I'd pull my sleeve down and go, oh, don't see that kind of thing. But he knew I wasn't having an easy life. And he had told his girlfriend about me, and she was accepting of me, even though she was normally pretty protective because Chris was super handsome. But here I was with a dilemma. How could I possibly know if my husband was killed? If there were holograms that can walk around looking just like him, am I being tricked? Are the guardians gonna, or is democracy gonna get me? Is Rob tricking me into going home? I was just full with all these kinds of questions. So Chris did a reading for me, and he pulled up cards that I knew the meaning of, but he was kind of saying, oh man, Lisa, you're in a big problem. Oh crap. He was very surprised at the reading. He couldn't believe what was coming up. But there was enough there that I could see that there was hope for me, that things were going to be okay. And there was one of the cards, literally, he said, there's going to be a blonde guy come into your life. And I didn't know what that meant because there was already a blonde guy in my life. So I had no idea what was going to happen. But I do know that Chris had his brother call me from Boston. His brother was in a relationship with a very prominent psychic, and they got on the phone with me the next morning and said, we don't know what's going on with you, but you better not meet with those people. I said people. I didn't say guardians of the universe to Chris, because Chris was not yet a paranormal researcher. But they made reference to a very large craft over the Atlantic Ocean. And when they said that, I said, you know what, that's a guardianship. All right, they're here. So I did agree to meet them. I went back to the condo the next day after work. They had given me 24 hours to make the decision as to whether I was going to go into the deal with them. What they had said to me the day before was that they had fished Rob's body out of the river, the East River. They had repaired it. He had been shot in the head, but he was still lifeless. They were going to reinfuse his spirit back into the body, but he was going to be starting over as a baby, and they were putting a baby spirit into a man's body, and they wanted me to raise it. And the way you just went is the way I went. Like, how do you take that in? I was afraid. I had just been nearly sliced to smithereens by my husband. He was saying he was going to be dead, and so was I, and I was afraid, and I was hiding. Then the guardians come along and say, tell me everywhere I had been for 72 hours, which upset me because I thought I was being real sneaky. You think you're alone and you're not. And I felt like I had no choice but to take the deal. And so I went back to the condo that night, and I went going up the elevator shaft. I had said to the doorman, don't let anybody in to come see me without announcing them. Don't let anybody get past you. And they said, yes, miss, we'll make sure nobody gets through. Ran in the condo and locked all the deadbolts. And no sooner was I in the door than I get a knock at the door. And I'm like, what the hell? I had just thought that I had escaped an elevator malfunction that may have, I wondered if it was going to drop to the 37 floors to the basement with me in it. And I'm thinking, wouldn't that be a crazy end to all this? And I get in, and there's knocking at the door, and I look out the peephole, and it's Rob's face. And I'm like, what? And the voice said, Lisa, it's the Guardians. This is number 10. We're not going to hurt you. Let us in. We're going to prove to you that Rob is dead. And I'm like, I couldn't figure out how that could possibly happen. And I was really afraid. But they said, hey, you don't have to, but we're offering to exchange favors with you. We can go away. And then I'm thinking about democracy again, these vigilantes who don't like me being out and about, knowing what all the stuff they were doing through my husband. So I let number 10 in, and he sits down and he takes me to sit with him. And I was terrified. I thought they were going to potentially kill me if Rob was trying to fake me out. He took my finger and said he was shot in the head. Took my finger and placed it in a hole in his skull. They said, we've repaired the body. Bone is harder to fix, but skin is easy, and you can't see the entry wound, but you can feel the hole in the skull. And my finger went into a hole about that far into the skull. Now, if you've been married to someone or been lovers with someone, you know every shape of their head. You've held it. You've loved it. You know where the bumps are. That hole was not there before. Who has a hole in their head like that? Nobody. And then so I'm stunned. I'm getting my mind blown. They took my fingers and went to the other side of the head and said, this was the exit point. The head is very squishy here. Again, the skin is repaired. You can't see it, but the bone was shattered. And it's going to have to take time to heal. It'll all grow together, but it's pretty much like the top of a baby's head, like the fontanelle. The skull really isn't there. You can press on the baby's head. His was even squishier than that. And this is when I realized everything that had been going on was in fact going on, which meant that Rob was dead, which meant that they had put his body back together and were operating it right in front of me. And they said, "Will you raise him?" And I didn't know whether I should cry, scream, freak out. It was the most confusing moment, but I didn't feel like I could get rid of democracy by myself, so I said that I would do it. We ended up, I didn't actually agree to it. They just went on as if I had. And I kind of was like too weak at that point, or too exhausted, or too mind blown to say I can't do this, because I didn't know how to deal with democracy. So we got in a cab and went back to our apartment in the East Village. That was on St. Mark's Place. And when I went in the apartment, it was spotless. The place on the wall where he had thrown a plate full of spaghetti at me was clean. All the furniture was gone. Much of it he had broken. All the broken dishes were cleaned up. It looked like it was move-in ready. But we had a card table that we would put up sometimes to use as a dining table if we were going to use furniture. We tended to sit on the floor as if Japanese. And I said, "Where's the card table?" And they said, "Oh, they used the card table to carry him out on after they shot him. They shot him over there, and that's why the wall is so clean. And they used your blanket to cover him up. They put him on top of the table and carried him out." And you could feel the sort of vibe, if you're intuitive, that a lot had happened there. And they said, "Okay, we're going to regenerate the body now. You have to sit down, sit on the floor, cover your eyes. If you open your eyes during this, you will be blinded. 10 will be with you for a little bit longer. It's going to be quiet for a little while, then you'll hear nothing, and then Tomar will be here. The newly regenerated Tomar will be here." So I'm sitting on the floor and covering like this to make sure that my eyes are covered. And in my ears, I was hearing roaring sound, pulsating sound, roar, 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 roar. And it was as if tidal waves were coursing through me from my head to my feet and back up. And it was so potent that I nearly passed out. At one point I started to tip and I was trying to still cover my eyes. I just almost just passed out. It was so powerful. I didn't know if I was going to be able to withstand it. I had never felt anything like that. It wasn't like a tingle. It wasn't like your arm being a little asleep or something like that. It was like a tsunami going up and down me repeatedly until I could hardly stand it. And then it got quiet. I heard nothing, and I still kept my eyes closed and covered. And then I heard a few steps, and then I heard scampering. And then I heard this voice, and it was Rob's voice, but it was like a 3-year-old Rob. And he goes, "I know you. You're my grower-upper. They made me out of Rob, but I'm not Rob." And I started to look, and he was hopping from one foot to the other. It was just doing some antsy little boy stuff. And I couldn't believe it. He was, and part of the rational mind was to say, he's faking it, he's acting, he just wanted me to take him back. But then I'm like, oh yeah, but there's the hole in the head. So for months, I kept putting my finger in the hole in the head so that I could go, This isn't a fake job. I needed that hole in the head to help me grasp what had happened. And now I had a 6'2" little boy who didn't know how to work a TV. I had been instructed not to let him watch too much TV or hardly any at all. They told me he didn't know much about anything. They had given him language. He was going to learn a lot. He was going to develop a lot, but shield him as much as you can. And I wonder sometimes if I didn't do a very good job under the circumstances, because I had to go to work. I was paying the bills. So I was leaving him in the apartment, and he was getting into the TV. I would unplug it and he wouldn't understand, and he would poke the button for like half an hour, thinking he could get it back on if he poked it enough. He spent a lot of time playing with our cats. Rob had collected quite a few cats, and Tomer spent a lot of time with cats. He began to develop, although he did some very comical things, and those are in the book. But at one point, he fell in love with the Smurfs lunchbox that he tackled a lunchbox display at the grocery store, yelled Smurfs, and tackled it and picked up the one he wanted, and I bought it for him. And that giant of a man walked around with a little lunchbox for many months, and people would look at him like, what is going on here? And I'd be like, don't ask. This is my kid. It was very perplexing at times. I became very secretive with all my friends. Who can you tell? Nobody. The deal was I was required by them for 20 months. I wondered why 20 months, and I think I know at this point. He was developing, and then he started wanting to have a job, and he told me at one point that he got a job. And I said, what kind of a job? And he said, oh, I take guns to New Jersey for some people. And I went, no, you don't. You quit that now. And I was very angry. And he said, well, they're going to be mad. And I said, I don't care if they're mad. You don't be doing that. He had been buying me jewelry and being very proud of that. And he was getting money from somewhere. I made him quit it. There was times when I had, due to being in the music business, I was working with many very famous recording artists. And when they were playing in New York City, I had to go to the show. So one night I had to go to the show. And I came home and was getting close to the house, and I began to recognize items from my refrigerator, wondering, this looks like my stuff. And I go in the lobby, and the doorman at our apartment said, you better get up there. Cops went up there. And I was like, what was he doing? Throwing stuff out the window that would make the cops come. So I went up, I went in the apartment, and there was blood everywhere. Blood on the floor. The cabinets were pulled off the walls. The microwave looked like a monster truck went over it. Blood, trails of blood. And I was like, what happened here? And then I started to think about democracy catching up with us or something. Only they were catching up with the wrong guy. Maybe that didn't make sense. And I found Tomer laying in the bed, covered up. Sheet was all bloody. His face was bashed up. I said, what were you doing why were the cops here? And he said, Lisa, those weren't cops. Those were the guys I quit working for. They wanted to make sure I was good and beat up. If I was throwing stuff out the window, they would have arrested me and taken me away, wouldn't they? And then I realized he was getting into some trouble, and it was the kind of trouble I didn't want. And that's when I decided I reached the point I'd had enough. I couldn't deal with it. And so I said, hey, we're not gonna make it all the way to, when the 20 months is done, I'm done. When I told him that we were going to live more like roommates than acting like a couple, because that was part of the requirement, was that we had to portray ourselves as a couple so that it looked continuous to Rob and Lisa. He started doing things that looked like he was putting a mission together. And he started leaving me with number 10. At that time, 10 once asked me if I would have a baby by Tomer, because they wanted the genetic composition. And I said, this is too hard. I can't do that. I'll have to pass. No, I already have a child. The child man. And he was getting to be really savvy, but he had started to work on something, and he began to let up on me that there was a situation of a munitions pileup that a faction was going to use to disrupt the government in China. And that was going to end up creating a situation that could lead to an alliance with China and Russia that could become disastrous to the United States. And they wanted to stop it. And I won't go into all the details about it because it is an incredulous story, which included the idea of them stealing a plane. But I will tell you, we all know what happens when somebody steals a plane, because we know from 9/11 that it does happen and it does change history. I also discovered that munitions stockpiles do get blown up, and that you can locate information about a number of times of that happening. So I said, wow, that's not so crazy. It actually happens. That's a thing. And then the other thing that I discovered was that, in fact, the government has lost F-16s and they don't know where they are. But the idea was...
Can you tell me why Rob went back to the democracy group?
Well, he didn't go back to the democracy group. He got involved with something, but it wasn't democracy. The part of the deal with the Guardians, when we had gone back to the apartment, was they wanted papers. And part of the deal was they said that they would collect Rob's records and use it, give it to the right people to get the democracy people, the linchpins, put away. And they said the 20 months was so that we had to move and get a different place to live. But the idea was that they would get the key people put away, but it would take time. So I'm sorry I left that part out. It was coming to me that the reason they wanted Tomar back on the planet was to have a mission to prevent this alliance between China and Russia from taking place that would ultimately lead to, in centuries from now, an alliance where China and Russia would gang up on the United States and there would be nuclear war, and that would be devastating. So it was more about changing the future, or the future beings coming back in time to make something not happen, so that when the time came, it wouldn't go the way it looked like things would go. And it wasn't specifically, well, yeah, it would be the Cold War, but it would be a Cold War going on in different centuries ahead to come. So time travel was involved in that one. So after he pulled that off, I decided to let my lease run out. I was a very weary 27, 28-year-old. It happened that my little sister, who was 19 at the time, got killed in a car wreck. And that was more than I could take at the time. And I was very weary from raising a baby man, a child, an infant, literally, in a man's body, up to being someone who could carry out something clandestine or meant to be helpful. I'm sure it was meant to be helpful. I'm sure it may have been something defensive. I wonder, from beings from the past may have sent someone back in time to make a correction so that they wouldn't have to deal with certain things. I don't have answers on that. It is an educated guess, I would say, but it is a guess. Anyway, I ended up getting my own place to live. Tomar somehow knew exactly where I was moving to, even though I had kept my lease and given it to a close friend, so that he couldn't know, but he managed to move to an apartment 4 miles away where I was moving, to have a window over at the front door of my building. So that made me feel like I wasn't really getting that far away from him. But he started to deteriorate. And I have wondered if craft exposure might have been part of his demise. According to his brother, he was diagnosed with AIDS. At the time, it was a bucket diagnosis like fibromyalgia is today. I'm speaking from my perspective, not from absolute fact, because by early 1990, I had decided to begin a new relationship, and that became the relationship that formed the family that I have 2 daughters from. They're grown now, and I've taken a lot of time living a very simple life, living quietly and doing my healing studies. By 2006, I realized I had always intended to become a healer, and I got myself trained and educated, certified through Healing Touch program, which is credentialed through the American Nurses Credentialing Center. So I have a legitimate credential, and I'm currently in the Brennan School of Healing Sciences, which to me may be the potentially one of the, if not the most advanced one of them in the world. And that's what I feel my calling is. And I know that there are quite a few people who are hurting because they've been isolated by being an experiencer. And I have worked with quite a few people who have been abductees or have had incursions in their home by dark beings. And one thing I like to work with them on is protection, setting the energy field in such a way that the boundaries are very solid and impermeable, unencroachable, and that there are aspects of personal power that make it possible for a person to command a being out of their presence. So I hope that a continuation of any benefit the book may have to anybody, I hope it will be something where if they do need healing, maybe they are mentally well, because I wouldn't be qualified to work with somebody if they were unwell, but unless they were under supervision of a healthcare professional. But if they're otherwise completely healthy and just experiencing low self-esteem or isolation or tremendous self-doubt or loss of personal power, then there's healing for that. And I wish everybody who's had experiences that were harmful in terms of being so mind-blowing that you don't feel confident in your life, that you don't feel like you belong here, you don't feel a part of everybody, you don't feel like you deserve what everybody deserves. Then I would hope there's a whole section in the book that talks about the spiritual aspects of what can come out of experiencing, and some things that I did in my own recovery process, because I had a lot of recovering to do. And as they say about healers, you can't take anybody anywhere you haven't been yourself. I've been there, and I've been on a 15-year healing process. And the book was very cathartic for me to do. And I had help from the angels who helped me get many of the interviews that I got. Robert Hastings was tremendously helpful. Chris O'Brien was tremendously helpful. And who knew that life, and you talk about grooming, that's such an appropriate question. who knew I was going to need the help of Christopher O'Brien when we were both working at a professional audio store on 45th Street in New York City in 1983? Who knew that I was going to need the help of Robert Hastings in 1981 before he had even released his book in 2008? It is as if life had set me up with many of the people that I was going to need to be able to do it, because I wasn't going to be able to do it by myself. It took a village, to coin a phrase. So that probably leaves you with a lot of questions, but
Yeah, I tend.
time runs.
Let's see. Yeah, I tend to say the universe provides,
I
and
agree.
now, how is Rob 2.0 still with us, or has he passed away?
Um, young Tomar, if I could call him that, because Rob used the name Tomar for his activities abroad or cosmically. Tomar only, he wouldn't let anyone call him Rob. And if I accidentally called him Rob, he cried. He has died. He deteriorated. He also had a devastating accident, and we don't know if it was intentional or whether he was pushed or whether he fell. He nearly died. Actually, according to Michael, he died repeatedly on the way to the hospital, and they brought him back. They had said that he would not walk again. He did walk, he rode a bike, and he did things, and I had lost track of him because I was so worn out and burnt. And the family kept his plight to themselves because he had been diagnosed with HIV. It's possible he could have gotten HIV from blood transfusions from the accident. It's, to my thinking, one thing I didn't mention was all through the years, the guardians would talk about him needing treatments for radiation exposure.
That was my next question. Yeah.
Yeah, they had talked about him needing, sometimes they called it heart rents, and it caused really quite a big commotion at the school because we were in high school the first time it happened, and there were at least 2 times where they said he's got to have a heart rinse. It strengthens the walls of a heart. He has the effects of radiation exposure from going to different quadrants and being on the ship and technology and stuff like that. Well, the first time it happened, they did it at school by the tennis courts, where we had kind of left the cafeteria on our lunch break, and the hologram came down and said, we're going to give him this treatment. And they took out a brown liquid and put it in a cup that he had and drank it down. Well, then they said that Rob was taken away in an ambulance and was hospitalized and blind and partially paralyzed. And the authorities thought that I did something to him. So I was under investigation for poisoning him, which was very scary. And how do you say, well, not really, that wasn't even him who drank that? You can't say these things. So I did my best to get through that, but it was very tough on me to have 2 scary cops taking me in a back room in the high school and questioning me. I told as much truth as I could, and then I bluffed the rest because you can't talk. Back then, we didn't have Star Wars the movie yet. We had so little to reference, and to say anything like what was really going on could only, to most people's thinking, point to mental illness. And I was not mentally ill. I was getting top grades. I was getting top scores on the essay, the college entrance exams. I was a very proficient violinist. I was in sports. I was doing a very busy, normal looking high school kid. And maybe that's what all high school kids are doing these days, is being as amazing as they can be because competition is so tough. But I was a smart girl, and Rob was way, way smarter. It was over 160. And his father confirmed that to me. And it was interesting when I finally told Chris O'Brien and I had written a screenplay. Michael, my brother-in-law, now my brother, we adopted each other because 3 of the brothers have passed away and one has dropped out of the family for reasons, his own reasons. And Michael, the youngest, we started talking about, Michael was a witness to Rob snapping his finger and shifting to something else. Michael said the name of it was Cam. It didn't use a number. K-A-M. So Michael was either seeing a different entity, which means there may have been a third entity, or it may have just had a different name in the Barclay household. And there were strange things that happened in the household. One time I went by the house, not a single light was on, even though all the cars were in the driveway. And I opened the door and went in because I was allowed to just go in. I was part of their family from high school. And the lights were on, and suddenly they were talking, but they were all sitting in a row on couches, as if they had been all lined up like on a shelf. And then suddenly the lights were on and they were blah, 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 blah. But when I was walking up the driveway, there wasn't a light on in the house. So there may have been some freezing there. I had been told at one point that there were androids involved in the household. That I don't talk about that much because that's concerning and disturbing to Michael. And I was told that Michael was just as close to human as you could get, but the older 2 brothers passed away very young after Rob, but very young. So the family basically is off planet. Mom, dad, the 3 oldest brothers, only Michael is left.
Well, let's call it a day, Lisa. Now you've been through a lot, so I'm glad that you've had the abduction event where you saw the grays, because at least if I were in your position, having been through all that and not seeing them physically, it would have been hard to. Rob could have been like a mastermind of an artist that he could change personas on the whim. So at least having that physical aspect to your contact really, at least if I were in your position, would have really helped.
Yep, the ship visit, and then with the UFO in the sky that all the neighbors saw, and telling me that it was going to happen before it happened. That a mastermind can't do that. They can't put something the size of World Trade Center featureless up in the sky and have it float a mile over the neighborhood.
So that was a guardianship, or was that Rob's?
I don't know what that was. If you look at the picture of it, what would you think it was on the book cover? What would you think? It was featureless, except for the incredible lightning light emanating omnidirectionally from the back of it, and then deep, deep purple clouds nesting it. Maybe it was a ship. Well, the Guardians did say, the hologram did say Rob brought a Guardian ship close to the ground. So maybe we could take their word for it, saying that is the form the Guardian ship took at that point. They did say that 45,000 people could be in there. I've heard and read things about the time. Space is a different situation on a craft like that. So,
Well, Lisa, thanks for coming on.
you're welcome.
And I appreciate all the details that you've been talking about today. So, yeah, I'm sorry that you had to go through these events. I know they're life-changing, and it builds character, but I guess you were able to take it.
I took it.
Um, Do you have maybe a last story to share with everyone or a closing statement?
You could point me in that direction, or a closing story would be, I reference Susie Hansen's book because she talks about the many people who have been, and you talked about grooming again, who have been primed to be authors, to be speakers, to spread the word. And it's a very trickle-down, gradual process. And I drafted the book in 1994 when I was freshly out of that range of experiences, and I wanted to get it written down before I started forgetting. And people found it very upsetting, and I hid it for many years. And then in 2007, I started getting telepathic messages that it was time to get it out. Robert Hastings believes that his whole life purpose may have been to get his book out. And I know many people feel like their life's purpose is to get the book out. And I think there may have been some design behind that. And one thing I want to say to everyone is we all have a purpose in life to be a gift to one another. And we teach each other, we support each other, we love each other if we can, to the best we can. And we are surrounded by beings of every possible form. And let's just be so supportive to one another when people see things that really knock them off balance for a while, because I had a tough time. It was hard, really hard. And the healing process is one way that really helped me understand what they were doing, because so much of what they were doing was based on principles of channeling. So I could tell another story if you like, if you did I leave any holes?
No,
But
you're
I
thorough.
would say I talked for quite a bit, and I get adrenalized when I talk about the reincarnation event or the regeneration or the re-infusion event, whatever one should call it. It was hard to accept, and it helps me to talk about it, and maybe it'll help someone to hear it. So I think it's really beautiful that you're doing this work, and I thank you, Mr. Gray,
Well,
because
thank you.
I know that you're doing it to help people. It is interesting and surprising and better than movies, because life is incredibly interesting and beautiful and surprising. But I think that your work has a lot of meaning and purpose. So thank you for letting me speak and be here with you today. Thank you.
You're a lovely person, so
Thank
a beautiful person, and you're an amazing speaker. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you.
And to those watching, for those watching, hope you enjoyed today's interview. I sure did. I'm your host, Mr. Great. Our interview's coming up, and I'll see you guys next time. So take care, everyone. Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Great, and thanks for watching today's episode. If you are an abductee, contactee, or experiencer, and you believe that your story could help others, please feel free to contact me through my YouTube channel email. When it comes to experiencers, the ET phenomena, and the future, remember, truth will out.